A medieval sword could cut a man's arm clean off.
But here's what's even more insane. That same sword weighed less than your laptop. Everything you think you know about medieval weapons is wrong. The weight, the design, how they were actually used, what they could and couldn't do. Hollywood turned the most sophisticated personal weapons ever designed into clumsy props. Today, we fix that. Real swords, real physics, real history. Let's go. Let's start with the biggest lie in every medieval movie ever made. In the movies, knights swing massive, heavy swords like they're swinging logs. 2 hands, massive effort, slow, powerful, brutal. Reality check. A standard medieval arming sword, the most common sword used by knights, weighed between 1.1 and 1.5 kilograms. That's roughly the weight of a large water bottle. Even the largest two-handed greatswords, the ones that look absolutely terrifying in museums, rarely exceeded 3 kilograms. That's less than a gallon of milk. Why does this matter? Because weight determines everything about how a weapon is used. A light, balanced sword isn't swung like an axe. It's controlled. It's precise. It's fast. Medieval swordsmanship wasn't about brute strength. It was closer to high-speed chess, reading your opponent, creating openings, exploiting gaps. The sword was a precision instrument, not a blunt object. The Knights Templar training manuals, yes, they had training manuals, describe swordplay in terms of angles, footwork, and timing. Not strength, not size, technique. The balance point. Here's something that genuinely amazed me when I first learned it. Medieval swordsmiths understood physics centuries before Newton wrote it down. Every well-made medieval sword has a carefully calculated point of balance, usually about a third of the way up the blade from the guard. This creates what's called a node of vibration, a point where impact shock is minimized. In modern terms, they engineered vibration dampening into handheld weapons in the 12th century, using nothing but hammer, fire, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. That is not primitive. That is extraordinary. Here's another thing movies get completely wrong. There wasn't just one type of medieval sword. There were dozens, and each one existed for a specific logical reason. The arming sword. The classic one-handed knight's sword, used from roughly the 10th to the 14th century, versatile, could cut and thrust, light enough to use with a shield. This is the sword you see in every Crusader depiction. When armor got heavier, thicker plates, better protection, the sword became less effective against armored opponents. So weapons evolved. The longsword. The longsword emerged around the 13th and 14th centuries, specifically as armor got better. Longer blade, two-handed grip, more reach, more power, more control. But here's the fascinating part. The longsword wasn't just used for cutting. Against heavily armored opponents, knights used a technique called half-swording, grabbing the blade with a mailed glove and using the sword as a thrusting weapon, driving the point through armor gaps. Think about that. They grabbed the sharp part of the sword, on purpose, because physics demanded it and they were pragmatic enough to do what worked. The falchion single-edged sword with a slightly curved, heavy blade, more like a large cleaver, used primarily by infantry and lower-class soldiers who couldn't afford a proper knightly sword. Brutal, effective, cheap to manufacture. The AK-47 of medieval swords, not elegant, but it absolutely got the job done. The estoc. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as full-plate armor became standard, a new weapon emerged. The estoc. No cutting edge at all. Purely a thrusting weapon. Rigid, reinforced blade designed specifically to punch through armor gaps. This is weapons evolution in real time. armor improves. Sword design responds, back and forth for 300 years. This is the question I know you've been waiting for. The movie moment. Sword meets armor, sparks fly, armor gets sliced open. Real answer, it's complicated. And more interesting than yes or no. Against chainmail. Early medieval armor was primarily chainmail, interlocked iron rings. Against this, a sharp sword was genuinely effective. The rings could be broken or pushed apart by a strong thrust or cut. This is why early medieval combat was so lethal. A good sword against chainmail was a serious threat. Chronicles from the First Crusade describe wounds that seem almost impossible. Limbs severed, torsos split. Some of these accounts are exaggerated, but the underlying physics is real. A sharp, well-made sword against chainmail at speed is devastating. Against plate armor, full plate armor, the stuff from the 14th and 15th centuries, is a completely different story. A sword slash against good plate armor does essentially nothing. The steel deflects it. That's literally what it was designed to do. Modern tests on reproduction plate armor confirm this. The sword cut against well-made plate leaves a scratch at most. The force is dispersed across the curved surface. This is why fighting techniques changed completely when plate armor became standard. You stopped trying to cut through armor. You started targeting the gaps: visor, armpits, back of knees, inside of elbows. The actual killing blows. Historical combat manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries, documents like Fiore de Liberis, Flos Duellatorum, describe exactly how armored combat worked. You close the distance, you grapple. You get your opponent off balance. Then you use a dagger, short, rigid, narrow blade, to find a gap. Under the chin, through the visor, into the armpit. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't cinematic, it was brutal, close, personal, and terrifyingly efficient. Okay, we've covered swords, but here's the truth. On a medieval battlefield, the sword was actually not the most common weapon. Not even close. The warhammer. When plate armor became dominant, knights on foot increasingly used pollexes and warhammers, because you can't cut through plate, but you absolutely can dent it. A warhammer strike against plate armor doesn't need to penetrate. The force transfers straight through the metal into the body underneath. Broken bones, concussion, internal bleeding. The armor becomes a liability. It transmits the shock directly to the wearer. This is why warhammers terrified armored knights far more than swords. You couldn't defend against physics. The English longbow draw weight of a war longbow, 80 to 150 pounds of force. For comparison, a modern Olympic recurve bow draws at around 50 pounds. An experienced English longbowman trained from childhood. Skeletal remains of medieval archers show permanently deformed spines and overdeveloped left arms from decades of training. The bow literally reshaped their bodies. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, approximately 6,000 English longbowmen fired an estimated 60,000 arrows per minute into advancing French knights. The French cavalry was destroyed before it reached the English lines. No sword did that. A peasant with a stick of wood and a string changed the outcome of major battles for over a century. The crossbow. The crossbow was so devastatingly effective against armored knights that in 1139, the Catholic Church's Second Lateran Council tried to ban it entirely. It called it a weapon hateful to God and unfit for Christians. They banned it against Christians specifically. Using it against Muslims and non-Christians was apparently fine. The ban was ignored almost immediately, because when something works that well, theology doesn't win. I want to close with something that genuinely changed how I think about medieval craftsmen. We treat medieval technology as primitive. It wasn't, not in weaponry. Pattern welding. Early medieval swordsmiths, particularly Viking Age smiths, used a technique called pattern welding. They twisted and folded multiple rods of iron together, then forge welded them into a single blade. The result was a blade with different carbon content in different layers, harder steel on the edges for sharpness, tougher iron in the core to absorb impact without snapping. A functionally graded material. Materials, scientists rediscovered this concept in the 20th century and called it a breakthrough. Medieval smiths were doing it in 800 AD. Quenching and tempering. Medieval smiths didn't have thermometers. They judged temperature by the color of the glowing metal. Orange, yellow, white. Each color meant a specific temperature, and they were accurate enough to produce blades that have survived 600 years and are still functional. Let me say that again, functional, after 6 centuries. Without modern quality control, without chemistry degrees, just accumulated human knowledge passed from master to apprentice generation after generation. The sword is not a weapon. It is a library of human ingenuity written in steel. That's not a medieval quote. That's mine, but I stand by it. Medieval swords. Not heavy, not simple, not primitive. Precision instruments, engineered solutions. Technology so good it lasted 500 years. Hollywood owes every medieval swordsmith a serious apology. If this changed how you think about medieval weapons, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. Next video, the Knights Templar. What really happened to them, and why the truth is stranger than every conspiracy theory combined. Drop a comment. Which weapon surprised you most? My money's on the crossbow ban. See you next week. Stay sharp. Literally.